This story is fictional. Any resemblance to real people or events is purely coincidental. 1. By the time Jonah Rossi turned into the crescent driveway of his parents' house in Bristol, the Father's Day lunch had already arranged itself into a performance. Cars lined the curb in a polite, expensive row. Folding chairs had been set across the back garden in careful symmetry. White linen moved in the wind like surrender flags, though nothing in that family had ever been surrendered without a private cost. From the open French doors came the low hum of relatives, neighbors, and old family friends who had spent years mistaking neat landscaping for decency. Jonah killed the engine and sat for a moment with both hands still on the wheel. At 28, he had learned that dread had its own textures. There was the fast, sharp kind that hit before exams, before surgery rotations, before the first night shift at the veterinary hospital. Then there was this older thing, this slower one, heavy as wet cloth, that came whenever his parents invited him somewhere public, and warm-toned and full of witnesses. A family lunch, a blessing, a toast, an anniversary. Events where every plate was polished, every smile held just a second too long, and every insult arrived dressed as concern. He checked his phone again, though there was nothing new on it except the message he had already read 3 times that morning. The solicitor's email remained at the top of his screen, discreet and ordinary, containing the kind of attachment that could move through a family like lightning through old wiring. Jonah did not open it. He did not need to. He already knew what it said, which signatures were on it, which dates mattered, which lies would no longer survive contact with paper. The garden gate stood open. That, more than anything, felt like a warning. He stepped out into June sunlight, carrying a bottle of wine he knew no one would open. He had bought it anyway because arriving empty-handed would become another line in the mythology. Jonah never thinks ahead. Jonah never contributes. Jonah still hasn't sorted himself out. The words changed shape over the years, but never their purpose. In his parents' version of events, he was not a son with a profession, a mortgage deposit, or a life beyond their reach. He was the family's cautionary tale, kept deliberately unfinished so his brother could look more complete. His mother spotted him first from the patio and lifted one manicured hand as though greeting a distant acquaintance. Eleanor Rossi had perfected the art of welcoming a person while making them feel late. Her smile had brightness but no heat. His father, Marco, stood near the drinks table with one arm around Jonah's older brother, Luca, whose confidence always seemed to expand in direct proportion to how much room Jonah was denied. There he is, someone called, not loudly, but with just enough cheer to summon attention. Heads turned. Conversations shifted. Jonah felt the familiar sweep of appraisal pass over him, measuring shoes, jacket, posture, the invisible category of success he had spent half his life being told he had somehow missed. He crossed the lawn and kissed his mother's cheek. Her perfume was floral and cold. "You made it," she said, touching his arm as if she were grateful. "We weren't sure with your schedule. It was Sunday," Jonah said. His father gave a broad, public laugh, the kind designed less for amusement than for ownership. Jonah, always the joker, still impossible to pin down. Luca grinned into his glass. Some things never change. No one said the word yet. They never did at first. They let it hang in the air like weather they all recognized. The guests were a mixture of old neighborhood loyalties and recent aspirational additions. An aunt who treated gossip like a devotional practice, a retired banker from 2 streets over, a married couple from Clifton who had once asked Jonah with unbearable kindness whether he was thinking of going back to school. There was also Priya, Luca's wife, standing near the hydrangeas with a plate in her hands and a face that looked more tired than composed. She gave Jonah the briefest nod, the kind exchanged between people who knew better than to speak honestly in the open. The meal drifted onward under the pretense of ease. Roast lamb, buttered potatoes, seasonal praise for the weather. Marco told stories that improved his own role in them. Eleanor corrected details that did not matter and ignored those that did. Luca occupied the center of everything without effort, talking loudly about expansion plans, refinancing options, short-term strain, long-term upside. He spoke the language of people forever borrowing confidence from tomorrow. Jonah answered politely when spoken to and otherwise watched. He watched his father fill glasses before they were empty. He watched his mother move through the guests like a curator checking labels. He watched Luca avoid Priya's eyes. He watched the sideboard through the dining room window, where the cake waited under a glass dome, frosted in pale cream, already positioned for photographs. Next to it lay a silver cake knife and, beneath the folded napkins, a cream envelope no one else had noticed yet. Then, with the timing of a trap closing softly, Marco rose to offer the blessing. The garden quieted, chairs angled forward. Eleanor lowered her gaze in that theatrical way she used when she wanted humility admired. Marco placed one hand over his heart and thanked Providence for family, sacrifice, resilience, and sons who made a man proud in different ways. At that, a few people smiled toward Luca. A few, less certain, glanced at Jonah. Marco let the silence ripen before adding that not every child took the straight road, but some eventually found their way if the family stayed patient enough. Luca chuckled. Eleanor sighed, as though patience were the holiest of burdens. A small ripple of knowing laughter passed around the table, and Jonah, looking past the cake, past the garden, past every year they had dressed humiliation as concern, finally saw the envelope shift in the breeze and reveal the solicitor's stamp on the back. 2. The red seal on the back of the envelope flashed and disappeared beneath the fold of a napkin. But once Jonah had seen it, the entire afternoon seemed to tilt around it. The noise in the garden resumed in a softened wave after Marco's blessing. Yet every laugh now sounded rehearsed to him, every fork against porcelain oddly precise, as though the guests had all become extras in a scene whose ending only one person in the crowd understood. He kept his expression neutral. That had taken years to learn. As a boy, Jonah had been easy to provoke. His face betrayed him before he could defend himself. Hurt arrived first in the eyes, then in the throat, then in the hands. His mother used to say that he was too sensitive for the real world, but what she meant was that he reacted too visibly for a family built on deniability. Luca had discovered it even earlier than their parents had. A kick under the table. A private taunt during church, a missing assignment hidden just before school. Then Jonah's outburst, the adult sighs, the small lecture about emotional control. In the Rossi household, the first person to bleed was always treated as the one who had made a mess. Now, he had discipline. He could hear his own father imply before 30 people that one son inspired pride while the other inspired endurance, and still lower his glass without a tremor. He could watch Eleanor reach across the table to straighten the cuff of Luca's linen shirt with a tenderness she had not shown Jonah in years, and still ask his aunt whether she wanted more potatoes. He could sit in that manicured garden, beneath strings of decorative lights, waiting for an evening they had no intention of letting him enjoy, and give them nothing dramatic enough to use later. That restraint had not come naturally. It had come from distance, from work, from exhaustion, and from the long, humiliating education of realizing that outrage was often less useful than records. His father sat back down to applause so mild it almost insulted the effort behind the speech. Marco accepted it with a solemn nod, then immediately reached for the wine. Eleanor resumed smiling at the guests with the softened face she wore in public, the face of a woman who had, according to neighborhood myth, held a difficult family together through sacrifice and grace. Jonah had once tried to explain to a friend that his mother's generosity was real, but selective, and that her kindness operated most beautifully when an audience could verify it. The friend had said that sounded like most mothers in posh parts of England. Jonah had laughed then. He did not laugh now. Across from him, Aunt Teresa leaned in, bracelets whispering against the table, She was his father's sister, silver-haired, observant, and dangerous in the way certain elderly women became when nobody thought to hide things from them anymore. "You look well," she said, studying him over the rim of her glasses. "Better than last Christmas. I feel better than last Christmas." "That wouldn't be difficult," she said. "Your mother seated you beside the patio heater even though it was broken." Jonah almost smiled. Teresa noticed everything and filed it away without ever promising fairness. She liked truth mainly when it arrived embarrassingly late. "Still at the clinic?" she asked. "Hospital now," Jonah said. "Full-time." Teresa lifted one brow. "Is that so?" Before he could answer, Luca leaned across with performative casualness. "Temporary though, isn't it? Or are you still doing a bit of this and a bit of that?" The phrasing was light. The intent was not. Several guests looked up immediately, as if their hunger for dessert had been replaced by a more traditional family appetite. Jonah set down his fork. "Full-time veterinarian," he said, his tone so even it nearly disappeared into the air. Luca gave a short laugh. "Right, of course. Sorry, I always lose track because your route was a little unconventional." There it was, not the word itself, but its tailored cousin. Unconventional. A polite suit over the same old insult. Dropout. The son who drifted. The son who disappointed. The son whose unfinished past could be produced at any gathering like a party trick. Jonah felt Priya glance toward him. When he looked up, she was already looking down at her plate. His mother intervened, but only to improve the shape of the wound. "Jonah has always done things in his own time," she said to the table, smiling as though translating a child for visitors. We worried. Naturally. There were years when we didn't know what he was doing from one month to the next. That was not untrue. Like most family lies, it contained just enough fact to survive scrutiny from strangers. There had been years of drifting. Years of bad rentals, dead-end shifts, unfinished coursework, panic attacks he hid beneath sarcasm, and the mortifying sensation of watching people younger than him move cleanly through a life he seemed to enter only through side doors. But the family version omitted its own contribution. The money promised then withheld, the emergencies exaggerated when he needed tuition, the calls insisting Luca needed help more urgently, the repeated reminders that not everyone was suited to serious study. Jonah had been 21 the first time Marco suggested he might be happier doing something practical with animals rather than chasing credentials he could not sustain. The cruelty of it had been sharpened by how nearly kind it sounded, and yet practical had turned into possible. Possible had turned into discipline. Discipline had turned into qualifications, completed in silence, partly because secrecy protected him from sabotage, and partly because he wanted one clean achievement untouched by family commentary. The retired banker from 2 houses over dabbed his mouth and smiled toward Jonah with the mild condescension of a man who mistook privacy for failure. "Good for you, lad. Finding your feet matters more than when it happens." Lucas swirled the wine in his glass. "Exactly. No shame in taking longer when academics weren't your thing the first time around." The table rewarded him with a few reluctant chuckles. Marco said nothing. He did not need to. His silence was usually agreement by delegation. Jonah let the moment settle. Beyond the garden wall, a siren moved faintly through the city and disappeared. Somewhere near the kitchen, a tray clinked. A cloud passed over the sun, and for one brief minute, the expensive lunch looked what it really was. Not elegant, not warm, just exposed. Then Aunt Teresa turned her head toward Eleanor and said, in a voice too casual to be accidental, "I thought I heard from someone at St. Griner's, Michael's, that Jonah had passed all his professional registrations some time ago." Eleanor blinked once. Marco looked down. Luca's hands stopped moving on the stem of his glass. And Jonah, suddenly aware that the first loose thread had been tugged in front of witnesses, saw Priya lift her eyes at last. 3. For a few seconds after Aunt Teresa spoke, the garden became strangely quiet, not silent in the literal sense, but stripped of the background ease that had carried the lunch forward. Knives paused midair. Someone at the far end of the table coughed softly, as if testing whether conversation was still allowed. Jonah did not move. He had learned long ago that when truth entered the room unexpectedly, the first reaction from his parents was not anger, but adjustment. Eleanor's mind worked like a careful accountant's ledger. Marco's like a strategist who preferred to reposition rather than confront. If a fact could not be erased immediately, they would reshape it, soften it, absorb it into a story that preserved their authority. So Jonah waited. Eleanor recovered first. Her smile returned, thinner but intact, the public version sliding neatly back into place. "Oh, Jonah has always had an interest in animals," she said gently. "Courses, short programs, that sort of thing. We encouraged him to explore it after he decided the university route wasn't for him." The explanation floated over the table like a decorative cloth laid over a stain. It sounded reasonable. It sounded maternal. To someone who had not lived inside the family for 28 years, it sounded almost generous. But Teresa did not nod. "No," she said slowly, adjusting her glasses again. "That's not quite what I heard." A faint crease appeared between Eleanor's brows. "What did you hear?" "That he passed the Royal College registration last year." Teresa's tone remained conversational, but there was steel in the edges. "Proper veterinary certification. That's not a weekend course." A few guests shifted in their seats. The retired banker looked from Jonah to Marco with new interest. Someone near the hydrangeas murmured something to their spouse. The conversation that had been drifting harmlessly around food and weather now tightened into something closer to inquiry. Jonah felt Luca's gaze land on him. "You're joking," Luca said, laughing lightly, but the laugh didn't reach his eyes. Jonah never finished his degree. That statement had been repeated so often it had hardened into family fact. It had been told to teachers, relatives, neighbors, even to people Jonah barely knew. Over time, it had grown roots, thick enough that the truth beneath it had almost disappeared. Almost. Jonah folded his hands on the table. "It took longer than expected," he said calmly. "But yes, I finished." The words were simple. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't dramatize them. He just placed them there. The effect was immediate. Marco leaned back in his chair, his expression tightening with the careful neutrality he used when something threatened his control of a room. Eleanor's smile remained, but her eyes flickered toward Luca for a fraction of a second, an instinctive check of the family hierarchy. Luca stared at Jonah as though trying to locate the trick in the statement. "Finished what exactly?" he asked. "Veterinary school." The answer landed harder this time. Priya looked up sharply. The retired banker straightened in his seat, curiosity overcoming politeness. "Wait," he said. "Properly qualified?" Jonah nodded once. "Last spring." A ripple moved through the table. For most people present, the information was mildly impressive. For the Rossi family, it was disruptive in a much deeper way. Their entire public narrative about Jonah depended on unfinished effort. The drifting son, the uncertain career, the quiet disappointment who proved indirectly how responsible Luca had been by comparison. A completed qualification didn't just contradict the story, it dismantled it. Eleanor recovered quickly, placing a hand lightly over her chest as if the revelation had filled her with maternal pride. "Well," she said brightly, "that's wonderful, darling. Why didn't you tell us sooner?" The question sounded affectionate, but Jonah heard the calculation underneath it. If the achievement had been hidden, it could still be framed as youthful stubbornness rather than parental ignorance. "I was busy working," he said. Marco cleared his throat. "Working where?" "At the Bristol Veterinary Hospital." A few people murmured approvingly. "That's the one near Clifton Down, isn't it?" someone asked. Jonah nodded. Luca leaned back slowly, his smile returning, though it carried a sharper edge now. "So the dropout finished after all." He said it jokingly, but the word hung in the air longer this time because the joke had lost its certainty. Jonah noticed Priya watching him with an expression that was no longer tired but puzzled. She had clearly known pieces of the story. Not the whole thing. Interesting, Luca continued, swirling his wine again. You should have mentioned that earlier. Would have saved Mum years of worrying. Eleanor gave a small laugh, though it sounded forced. Exactly. We always hoped he'd land somewhere stable. Jonah let the moment stretch. Across the table, Aunt Teresa's eyes narrowed slightly as if she sensed something larger moving beneath the surface. Because finishing veterinary school had never been the real surprise. The real surprise was still sitting quietly under a folded napkin on the sideboard beside the Father's Day cake. And Jonah could feel the moment drawing closer when someone would finally notice the envelope. 4. Conversation tried to restart after the revelation, but it moved differently now, like a machine running with a gear slightly out of alignment. Plates shifted, forks scraped softly across porcelain, and several guests made polite attempts to steer the topic back toward weather, travel plans, or the peculiarities of Bristol traffic. Yet the earlier rhythm never quite returned. The simple fact that Jonah had quietly finished something the family had long treated as unfinished had introduced a subtle instability. It was not dramatic, not explosive, but enough to make people look again. Marco felt it too. He leaned forward, elbows resting lightly on the table, adopting the calm authority that had served him well in both business meetings and family confrontations. The trick, Jonah knew, was always to reclaim the narrative before curiosity developed momentum. Well, Marco said, his voice warm again. That's good news. Truly. You see, patience pays off. Everyone finds their path eventually. A few guests nodded. Jonah recognized the maneuver instantly. Marco was reframing the information so that it supported the same old story. The patient parents, the wandering son who finally matured under their quiet guidance. It would have worked too if Jonah had come today with nothing more than the qualification itself. But today was about timing. Across the table, Luca had begun speaking again about finances, something about short-term pressure and property leverage. The topic arrived conveniently, as it always did with him, because money was the language that kept Luca in the center of any room. The refinancing should clear by autumn, he said, gesturing lightly with his glass. It's mostly paperwork at this stage. Priya shifted slightly beside him, but said nothing. Jonah noticed Teresa watching Luca carefully. Refinancing? What exactly? She asked. Just restructuring the mortgage on the house and a few associated assets, Luca replied smoothly. Interest rates, you know. Marco nodded approvingly. Temporary adjustments for long-term stability, he added. To anyone else, it sounded ordinary. Property owners refinanced constantly. It was the polite machinery behind comfortable lives. But Jonah knew exactly which assets Luca meant. The house, the adjoining rental property. The small piece of commercial land Marco had purchased years earlier when the neighborhood was cheaper and the future seemed easier to predict. All of it tied together through paperwork that Luca assumed he controlled. Across the garden, the sunlight shifted again, glancing off the dining room windows and briefly illuminating the sideboard inside. For a moment, the envelope caught the light. Jonah saw Teresa's gaze follow it. Her eyes lingered. Then she tilted her head slightly. "What's that?" she asked, pointing toward the window. Several heads turned. Eleanor followed their gaze and immediately stood. "Oh, just something from the solicitor," she said quickly. She stepped toward the house with the careful composure of someone who understood exactly how dangerous unscheduled paperwork could become in a room full of witnesses. But Teresa had already risen too. "A solicitor on Father's Day?" she said mildly. "That sounds festive." A few people chuckled. Eleanor reached the sideboard first. Her hand moved toward the envelope. Jonah spoke before she could pick it up. "It's all right, Mum." Her fingers stopped. He rose from his chair slowly. "I asked them to send it here." The words were quiet but unmistakable. 20 pairs of eyes shifted toward him. Marco frowned. "You asked who?" "The solicitor." Eleanor turned, the envelope still resting untouched on the table beside the cake. "Why would a solicitor be sending you documents here today?" Jonah walked toward the open doors of the house, each step measured, unhurried, because today was the first time everyone who needed to hear it would be in the same place. That answer landed heavier than anything said earlier. Guests exchanged glances. Priya looked suddenly alert. Luca stood halfway from his chair. What documents? Jonah reached the sideboard. The envelope lay exactly where he expected it. Cream paper, official seal, his name printed neatly in the corner. He lifted it and turned back toward the garden. For years, Jonah had imagined this moment differently. In his early 20s, he pictured anger, confrontation, a dramatic unveiling of every injustice carefully cataloged in memory. But time had changed the tone of the story. Now he simply held the envelope and looked at his parents. It concerns the refinancing Luca mentioned, he said. Marco's jaw tightened. What about it? Jonah met his gaze evenly. It can't proceed. The sentence moved through the garden like a slow electrical current. Luca laughed once, sharp and dismissive. Don't be ridiculous. That's already arranged. Jonah slid one finger under the seal and opened the envelope. Not anymore. And as the paper inside unfolded in his hands, the quiet lunch in the Rossi garden began to feel less like a celebration and more like the opening scene of a very public correction. 5. The paper made a soft sound as Jonah unfolded it, no louder than the rustle of leaves moving along the garden wall. Yet in the stillness that had settled over the table, it might as well have been a bell. No one spoke. Jonah did not immediately read from the page. He had already memorized the contents. Instead, he looked first at his father, then at Luca, then briefly at Eleanor, who had not moved from the doorway of the house. Marco was the first to break the silence. What exactly are you doing? He asked, his voice low but tight. Jonah stepped back out onto the patio so everyone could see him clearly. The afternoon light fell across the paper in his hand, illuminating the solicitor's letterhead. Clarifying something, he said. Lucas snorted and drained the rest of his wine. This is absurd. Whatever drama you're staging, save it for later. We're in the middle of lunch. Jonah glanced toward the table. Actually, that's why it needed to happen now. The words were simple, but the timing behind them was deliberate. He had chosen Father's Day for a reason. The room, or rather the garden, contained exactly the witnesses required for the truth to become unavoidable. Extended family, neighbors, longtime acquaintances who knew the Rossi name well enough to repeat whatever they saw today with confidence. Teresa leaned forward slightly in her chair, fascinated. Priya remained still, her gaze fixed on the paper. Marco rose from the table slowly, the calm authority returning to his posture. If this concerns family business, he said, we'll discuss it privately. Jonah shook his head. It stopped being private when the refinancing documents were filed. That sentence landed harder than the first. Luca's expression sharpened. What refinancing documents? Jonah held up the paper. The ones submitted 6 weeks ago to restructure the mortgage on the house and 2 additional properties. Luca stared at him. And how exactly would you know about that? Because my name is on them. The garden froze. For a moment, the sentence did not seem to register. It simply hung in the air like a misplaced object. Then Marco laughed, a short, controlled sound. That's impossible. Is it? Jonah asked. Eleanor finally stepped fully onto the patio. Jonah, darling, she said carefully, I'm sure there's been some misunderstanding. The refinancing paperwork was handled through Luca's financial advisor. Yes, Jonah said. That's correct. Luca folded his arms. Then stop pretending you're involved. Jonah lowered the page slightly and looked directly at him. I'm not pretending. Across the table, the retired banker leaned forward, his professional instincts clearly awakening. Hold on, he said. If his name is on the refinancing application, he would have needed to sign. Marco's eyes snapped toward him. That's not relevant. Actually, the banker said quietly, it is. Jonah placed the document on the patio table beside the cake knife. 6 years ago, he said, when Luca's first business expansion ran into trouble, the house was partially transferred to secure the loan. Marco's expression darkened. You don't understand the structure. I do, Jonah said calmly. I had it reviewed. Luca shook his head impatiently. This is ridiculous. Even if your name appeared somewhere, it wouldn't matter. The property is family-owned. Yes, Jonah said, but not entirely the way you think. He tapped the paper once. During that transfer, 20% of the property title was placed under my name. A murmur moved through the table. Eleanor blinked. That was temporary, she said quickly. Only a technical adjustment. Jonah nodded. Temporary arrangements still create legal ownership. Marco's voice hardened. You never contributed a penny to this house. That's true. Jonah did not raise his voice. But ownership doesn't require contribution once it's legally recorded. The retired banker rubbed his chin thoughtfully. If the title includes him, any refinancing would require his consent. Luca's smile had vanished. You're saying you blocked it? Jonah looked at him steadily. No. He paused just long enough for the silence to stretch. I'm saying you never had permission to file it in the first place. The effect was immediate. Priya's head snapped toward Luca. Marco stepped closer to the table, anger finally breaking through the polished surface of the afternoon. That's nonsense. Jonah slid the solicitor's document across the table toward Teresa. You can read it if you'd like. She adjusted her glasses and picked up the paper. Her eyes moved across the page slowly, and as the meaning settled into the lines of her face, the polite Father's Day gathering began to feel less like a family lunch and more like the opening moment of a legal problem unfolding in public. 6. Teresa did not rush. That was the first thing everyone noticed. In most families, a dramatic document appearing at lunch would trigger immediate commentary. Gasps, accusations, the sharp crack of questions fired too quickly to understand the answers. But Teresa read the way someone with long experience read uncomfortable information. Slowly, silently, and with careful attention to every line. The garden watched her. Jonah stood beside the patio table, hands relaxed at his sides. Marco remained standing across from him, jaw tight, eyes flicking between Teresa and the paper like a man waiting for a verdict he already disliked. Luca had stopped pretending the moment was a joke. Priya had not touched her plate in several minutes. A faint breeze moved across the garden, lifting the corner of a napkin and carrying the smell of roasted lamb somewhere past the hedge. Finally, Teresa lowered the document slightly. Interesting, she said. The word landed like a stone dropped into still water. Marco's patience broke first. What does it say? Teresa didn't answer immediately. Instead, she looked at Jonah over the top of the page, her expression shifting from curiosity to something closer to approval. You had this prepared by a solicitor, she said. Yes. And filed properly? Yes. She nodded once, then placed the paper back on the table. Well, she said, that complicates things. Luca exhaled sharply. Complicates what? Teresa turned the document slightly so several people at the table could see the header. According to this, she said calmly, 20% of the property title was transferred to Jonah during the loan restructuring 6 years ago. Marco waved his hand dismissively. We already established that. It was procedural. Teresa tapped the page. Procedural or not, it means the refinancing Luca mentioned requires Jonah's written authorization. The retired banker leaned in further, now fully invested. Correct. Luca let out a short laugh that sounded more strained than amused. Fine. Then we'll get his authorization. He looked directly at Jonah. Sign the form and stop embarrassing everyone. The command carried the same tone Luca had used since childhood when asking Jonah to hand over something inconvenient. A toy. A chore, a responsibility. For years, Jonah had complied. Now he simply shook his head. No. The word was quiet but final. Luca blinked. What? I'm not signing. The garden tightened again. Marco's voice lowered to the dangerous calm he used when negotiations turned serious. Jonah, you're misunderstanding your position. Jonah met his gaze evenly. I understand it perfectly. This house is your family's home. Yes, your mother lives here. Yes. Then stop behaving like a stranger and sign the authorization. Jonah did not move. I can't. Luca's patience evaporated. You mean you won't? Jonah paused for a moment. Then he answered carefully, "Both." The silence that followed was heavier than before. Across the table, one of the neighbors shifted in his chair, clearly wishing he had chosen a quieter Father's Day lunch invitation. Priya finally spoke. "Why can't he sign it?" Her voice was calm, but the question cut directly through the tension. Luca glanced at her sharply. "Because he's being difficult." Jonah looked at her. "Because the refinancing application already lists my authorization." Priya frowned. "What does that mean?" Jonah lifted the second sheet from the envelope. "It means someone submitted my consent without asking me." The air seemed to thin. Marco's expression hardened. "Be careful with what you're implying." "I'm not implying anything." Jonah placed the second page beside the first. "I'm pointing to the signature." Several guests leaned forward instinctively. The banker adjusted his glasses. Teresa picked up the new page. Her eyes moved across it quickly this time. Then she looked up. "Luca," she said quietly, "did you file refinancing documents using Jonah's name?" Luca's face flushed. "Don't be ridiculous." Teresa turned the page toward Marco. "The signature is here." Marco looked down. For the first time that afternoon, uncertainty crossed his face, because the signature printed beside Jonah Rossi's name looked convincing at a glance. But Jonah knew exactly why the solicitor had sent the letter that morning, because the signature wasn't his. 7. The afternoon air suddenly felt heavier, charged with a tension that had been simmering beneath polite smiles for decades. Guests who had been leaning back casually in their chairs now straightened, sensing the shift. Conversations died mid-sentence, the clink of silverware fading into a faint hum of anticipation. Jonah held the two documents steadily in his hands, letting the weight of their presence settle over the patio. The words on the page were enough, but the silence they created carried the real gravity. Luca's jaw tightened, the blood rushing visibly to his neck as he struggled to regain control of a situation he had always dominated. For years, the family had conditioned Jonah to take the subordinate position, the quiet disappointment, the drifting son, the one whose failures highlighted the other's successes. Luca had assumed the narrative would continue indefinitely. Today, that assumption ended. Marco stepped closer, his hands lightly resting on the table as if to anchor himself. His voice, calm and measured, carried authority born from years of unchallenged dominance. "Jonah," he said carefully, "this is a misunderstanding. Surely the solicitor can clarify." Jonah's eyes flicked briefly to his father, neutral but unyielding. The solicitor had already clarified. The signature, the authorization, the title, all of it was exactly as Jonah had said. Every procedural detail matched the reality the family preferred to ignore. Priya's hand hovered over her mouth, suddenly aware of the magnitude of the unfolding truth. For months, she had known fragments about Jonah's achievements and competence, but she had assumed the larger family system would remain intact, unquestioned, untouchable. The documents disproved that illusion. Luca's voice rose slightly, now tinged with panic. "This is absurd." He gestured toward the papers. "You can't. These aren't valid. They're a mistake." Teresa, however, did not flinch. She adjusted her glasses and examined the documents with the precision of a judge reading evidence. No mistakes, no ambiguity. The authorization was authentic, the transfer of the title legally binding, and Jonah's name was not a token, it was authority. A few guests exchanged glances. The retired banker leaned forward, murmuring something about proper legal procedure and the impossibility of overturning recorded signatures. The implication landed. Luca, who had believed himself in complete control, was now powerless to act without Jonah's acknowledgement. Jonah lowered the document slightly, his voice quiet but deliberate. "You see," he said, "the refinancing cannot proceed. Not because I refuse it, because it has already been recorded with my authorization." The garden seemed to shrink in response. The perfectly arranged table, the carefully composed guests, the white linen, the waiting cake, all of it became a stage for a revelation far larger than any intended celebration. Eleanor's hand trembled slightly as she placed it over her chest. Marco's face, usually composed and commanding, revealed a flicker of unease he could not hide. Luca's confident posture faltered. Priya's eyes widened, processing the impossibility of what she was witnessing. And as Jonah straightened, letting the documents lie open on the table where everyone could see, he realized that the quiet restraint he had cultivated for years was now more powerful than any argument, any plea, any manipulation the family could attempt. The first ripple of panic passed across the Rossi household, but it was only the beginning. Because once ownership, legality, and public acknowledgement aligned, the afternoon no longer belonged to Marco or Luca or Eleanor. It belonged to Jonah, and the cake, waiting innocently under its glass dome, was about to witness a Father's Day no one present would forget. 8. The cake sat at the center of the sideboard, pale cream frosting glinting in the sunlight, untouched as if waiting for the signal. It had been positioned meticulously for photographs, the perfect backdrop for a happy Father's Day, complete with Marco's proud smile and Luca's polished charm. Yet the presence of the documents on the patio table had shifted everything. No frosting, no candles, no ceremonial knife could distract from the truth now visible to every guest. Jonah's gaze flicked briefly toward the cake. It was absurdly ordinary, its sweetness and ornamentation mocking the chaos now unfolding. He didn't need the cake to make his point, but the contrast mattered. Celebration versus revelation, indulgence versus justice. He let the eye contact travel across the table, lingering on each face, letting the weight of the moment settle into the minds of witnesses. Marco leaned closer, speaking carefully now, as if choosing words might somehow reclaim authority. "Jonah," he said, "the refinancings must be a misunderstanding. You cannot possibly have control over decisions you weren't involved in." Jonah held the documents firmly, his calm, deliberate, almost surgical. "I was involved in exactly the way the law requires," he said. "Every signature, every authorization, every procedural step was recorded and verified. The refinancing cannot proceed without my consent because my consent has already been given months ago under the legal structure you assumed you controlled." Luca's laughter cracked in the tension, but it was hollow. His hand gripped the back of his chair, knuckles whitening. "You're bluffing," he said. "No bank would allow this to happen." "I'm not bluffing," Jonah replied. "The bank accepted it, and the records confirm it. The solicitor sent the confirmation this morning. That's why it's here." Eleanor's face paled, a flicker of color betraying her internal scramble. She had always relied on appearances to maintain control, but public evidence, especially in front of witnesses, was merciless. There was no room for subtlety, for spin, or for delay. The proof lay before everyone. Guests murmured quietly, sensing the shift in the room. The retired banker leaned closer, pointing subtly toward the documents. "If these signatures are valid," he said, "the refinancing is legally bound. Anyone trying to act otherwise risks liability." Priya's eyes widened as she glanced from Luca to Jonah. Her voice trembled slightly. "But if it's already done," she whispered, "why? Why are they panicking?" Because Jonah thought they never accounted for the possibility that I would collect the proof, align the timing, and let the right witnesses be present. Every humiliation they had planned for years, every assumption of my incapacity, every whispered warning about my inadequacy, all undone not by argument, not by emotion, but by preparation and records. Luca's voice rose, sharp and urgent. "This isn't happening," he shouted, gesturing toward the documents. "You can't. This is illegal." Jonah shook his head. Calm, even, precise. "The law says otherwise, and I've made sure of it." Eleanor covered her mouth with one hand. Marco's face was tense, jaw working as he processed the scale of the disruption. The guests shifted uneasily, understanding for the first time that the family drama they had assumed would be performative had transformed into institutional consequence. Jonah's gaze returned to the cake. In a different life, it might have been sliced and shared with polite congratulations. Now it was a silent witness, frosting untouched, glass dome reflecting sunlight like a lens, capturing the unfolding reckoning. He turned slowly toward the family, his voice firm. This afternoon is no longer about appearances, it is about reality. And with that declaration, the first truly irreversible change in the Rossi household began. The old hierarchy, the public deceptions, the assumed obedience, all of it now vulnerable. The garden held its breath, and somewhere, behind the polite faces and the stiff linen, the first panic pulse began to rise, ready to explode. 9. The shift in the garden was subtle at first, almost imperceptible, like the moment a tide begins to turn. Guests exchanged glances, realizing that the afternoon had become more than just a formal Father's Day gathering. Whispers began to ripple along the edges of the table. "Did you see that? Is this really happening? I thought Luca handled everything." The air carried a tension that no polite conversation could dissolve. Marco stepped closer to Jonah, lowering his voice but not his authority. "Jonah," he said, "this is unnecessary. Surely we can handle this quietly without drawing attention from everyone here." Jonah shook his head slightly, eyes steady. "It's already public," he said. "The solicitor's documents arrived this morning for exactly this reason." Marco blinked, the calculated calm in his voice faltered. "You don't understand the implications," he said. "This could create chaos, financially, socially." And Jonah nodded. That was exactly the point. Chaos was the natural consequence of years of mismanagement, dishonesty, and assumed control. The Rossi family had spent decades relying on hierarchy and fear, and today Jonah intended to show that both could be dismantled with precision. Luca's expression hardened. He stepped toward the patio table, voice rising despite the afternoon's polite restraint. "You have no right," he shouted. "This is family property. How can you—" "Legally, I do," Jonah interrupted, calm but firm. "And the law recognizes the timing, the signatures, and my recorded authorization. The refinancing cannot continue without my acknowledgement because my acknowledgement has already been recorded." The retired banker leaned forward, whispering quietly to another guest. "That's a solid move," he said. "If he's documented properly, any attempt to override him would be risky." Guests' murmurs grew. Curiosity sharpened into disbelief. Nobody had expected this calm, unassuming young man, long dismissed as the family disappointment, to command control so completely. Priya finally spoke, her voice almost trembling. "Luca, what does this mean for the properties?" Jonah glanced at her, careful to maintain neutrality, careful to let the weight of the revelation settle evenly across the witnesses. "It means," he said softly, "that no refinancing, no transfers, no changes can occur without my consent. And because it has already been authorized under my name, any further action is invalid unless it follows the law." Eleanor's hand trembled slightly as she reached for a napkin. Marco's face darkened, jaw tightening. Luca's usual confidence faltered visibly for the first time in years. Aunt Teresa adjusted her glasses, eyes narrowing. She leaned closer to the documents, scanning them with methodical precision. "Indeed," she said, "this appears unassailable. Any attempt to bypass it would create legal liability." The guests around the table shifted uneasily. They had come expecting Father's Day cheer, familial politeness, and perhaps a minor performance of family tension. Instead, they were witnessing a quiet but undeniable assertion of authority, one that completely overturned the old family hierarchy. Jonah let the silence stretch, letting the documents rest on the table where all could see. The cake remained untouched, the glass dome reflecting light like a lens amplifying the drama. Finally, Marco spoke again, voice measured but strained. "Jonah, surely we can negotiate something." "No," Jonah said. "The legal record is clear. There is nothing to negotiate." For a moment, no one breathed. The weight of decades of expectation, humiliation, and assumed control pressed down on the Rossi family. And in that quiet, Jonah realized something he had long known. Restraint, timing, and preparation had become more potent than anger, pleading, or manipulation. The first public fracture in the Rossi household had arrived, and the reverberations were only just beginning. 10. The guests' murmurs became a low hum of realization. Faces that had once smiled politely now held the tension of people watching a carefully hidden machine suddenly spring to life. Each person at the table, each observer in the garden, was suddenly aware that the afternoon had shifted irreversibly. Jonah had never raised his voice, yet every word and every document in his hands spoke louder than any shout could have. Luca moved closer to the table, attempting to reclaim the familiar position of authority. He leaned over the documents as if proximity alone could bend them to his will. "This is ridiculous," he said sharply. "I've handled these matters for years. You have no idea how this works." Jonah lifted his gaze calmly to meet Luca's. "I understand it completely," he said. "Every procedural detail, every signature, every date." The solicitor confirmed it this morning. Marco stepped forward, his tone tightening. "Jonah, this is not a performance. We're discussing family property." "Exactly," Jonah replied, "which is why everyone here needs to understand the truth." The banker adjusted his glasses, whispering to a guest, "If the documents are legitimate, any action taken without Jonah's recorded consent is invalid. Legally, any attempt to refinance or transfer these properties without him could constitute fraud." The realization spread like a ripple. Marco's face, usually calm and commanding, now betrayed a flicker of unease. Luca's posture, always confident and controlling, had become defensive. Eleanor's hand trembled slightly as she reached to steady herself against the sideboard. Teresa, however, remained steady. She adjusted her glasses, eyes scanning the papers with the precision of someone trained to detect every detail. She looked up, finally, and her voice carried the weight of judgment. "Luca," she said quietly, "have you submitted refinancing documents using Jonah's name without his consent?" Luca's face flushed. "Don't be absurd," he muttered, attempting to dismiss the question. Teresa placed the documents down in front of him. "The signer's here." Marco's jaw tightened. This cannot be. Jonah's expression remained calm, almost serene. "It's exactly what it says," he replied. "The authorization exists, it is valid, and no refinancing can proceed without it." Priya finally stepped forward. "So, he's in control?" she asked quietly. Jonah nodded. "Not by choice, but by law," he said. The weight of the revelation settled over the Rossi household. For decades, Jonah had been dismissed, marginalized, labeled the dropout who would never matter. Today, that narrative was shattered, not through confrontation, but through meticulous preparation and quiet timing. The garden seemed to shrink under the tension, the sunlight catching the glass dome of the cake, as if spotlighting the final act. Guests shifted in their seats, recognizing that they were witnessing a rare moment. A private family hierarchy undone publicly, irrevocably, and without a single raised voice. And Jonah, standing beside the patio table, knew the next moments would define the remainder of the afternoon. Because now the Rossi family would have to confront not just their assumptions, but the tangible consequences of years of neglect, manipulation, and hidden control. The cake, still untouched, waited silently for the first move. And the first move was coming. 11. The garden seemed to contract around them, as if the neatly trimmed hedges and white linen chairs could sense the fracture forming at the center of the Rossi household. Jonah remained motionless beside the patio table, documents in hand, letting the weight of the moment settle over every witness. Every pair of eyes was on him now, waiting to see what he would do next, aware that decades of family assumption had just been challenged and overturned. Marco's voice, usually steady, now carried a brittle edge. "Jonah," he said carefully, "this is a mistake. Surely the solicitor can clarify. There's no need to escalate this publicly." Jonah's gaze met his father's evenly, measured, unflinching. The solicitor already clarified. The authorization, the signature, the transfer, everything is valid and recorded. The refinancing cannot proceed without my acknowledgement because it has already been properly submitted under my name. Luca's hands clenched on the back of his chair. "You're lying," he shouted, unable to mask the rising panic. "You can't possibly have done this." "I haven't done anything improper," Jonah said, voice calm and firm. I've acted entirely within the law. The garden's tension thickened. Guests who had come expecting a polite Father's Day lunch now sat in the uncomfortable awareness of a family hierarchy unraveling. Murmurs drifted like distant thunder. Is this really happening? I thought Luca controlled everything. He's serious. Eleanor's hand trembled slightly as she touched the sideboard, her gaze flicking to the cake as if it could anchor the chaos. Marco's face darkened, jaw tight as he realized the depth of the situation. Luca's usual confidence faltered completely, replaced by a tension that his carefully rehearsed smiles could not conceal. Teresa, however, remained still and composed. Adjusting her glasses, she leaned over the documents like scanning them with methodical precision. Her eyes lifted, narrow and unwavering. "Luca," she said quietly, "have you submitted refinancing documents using Jonah's name without his consent?" Luca's flush deepened. "Don't be ridiculous," he muttered, attempting dismissal. Teresa laid the papers flat before him. "The signature is here." Marco's voice lowered, tight and controlled. "This is impossible." Jonah's calm response cut cleanly through the tension. "It is exactly what it says. The authorization is valid, and no refinancing can proceed without it." Priya, finally stepping closer, whispered in shock, "So, he's in control?" Jonah nodded, letting the quiet certainty of his answer resonate. "Not by choice," he said, "but by law." The retired banker leaned slightly forward, murmuring to a guest in the nearest chair. "Any attempt to override this legally would be risky," he said. "Liability alone would make the Rossi family cautious." The weight of the revelation pressed on everyone. For years, Jonah had been dismissed, called a dropout, rendered invisible in matters both financial and familial. Today, the narrative was reversed, not through confrontation or theatrics, but through precise preparation and quiet timing. The sunlight caught the glass dome covering the cake, glinting like a spotlight over the scene. Guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats, realizing they were witnessing something irreversible, the quiet collapse of a family hierarchy in real time. And Jonah, standing poised beside the patio table, felt the first tremor of movement, because someone had finally to make the next move. And that move would not be easy. 12. The first tremor began with Luca. His face, once composed and smug, tightened as he took in the documents and the calm authority behind Jonah's presence. Years of assumed control, years of rehearsed dominance, now seemed hollow. He stepped closer to the patio table, his voice pitched just above polite conversation, though the sharp edge betrayed panic. "You don't understand," he said. "This is procedural. There must be some error." Jonah's gaze met his brother's evenly, unflinching. "No error," he said. "Every signature, every authorization, every detail has been confirmed. The solicitor sent the verification this morning." Guests shifted in their seats. A few exchanged glances that combined astonishment and intrigue. The Father's Day lunch had morphed into a demonstration of legal reality, and no one had seen it coming. Marco's expression hardened, his jaw working as he considered what had happened. "Jonah," he said, quietly, "surely there's room to resolve this without escalation." "I see no need to escalate," Jonah replied. "The law and the timing have done that already. The refinancing cannot proceed without my acknowledged consent, which has been properly recorded." Eleanor placed her hand over her chest, taking a subtle breath as if to steady herself. Her eyes flickered between Jonah and the documents. For decades, she had relied on appearances to hold the family narrative together. But public proof now demanded acknowledgement that she could not control. Luca's fists clenched. "You're bluffing," he shouted. "Banks don't accept this lightly." "I'm not bluffing," Jonah said, calm but precise. The bank accepted it, and the solicitor confirmed it. The garden seemed to contract with the weight of every whispered realization. The retired banker leaned forward, adjusting his glasses. "Legally," he said, "any action taken without Jonah's documented consent would be invalid. Anyone attempting otherwise would risk liability." Priya stepped closer to Jonah, her eyes wide. "But," she whispered, "you're saying no one here can override it?" Jonah nodded. "Correct. The authorization is valid, and any attempt to bypass it is legally impossible. Marco's hand moved toward the table, perhaps to reclaim control, perhaps to intimidate, but he hesitated. He recognized finally that the balance of power had shifted entirely. Luca's usual bravado was gone, replaced by the first genuine panic the family had ever seen in him. Teresa, still seated, adjusted her glasses. She placed one hand on the documents, scanning them again. Any attempt to circumvent this, she said, would be legally risky. The signatures are authentic, and the timing is indisputable. The guests whispered among themselves, sensing the magnitude of what they were witnessing. For the first time, they saw the quiet, dropout son not as a figure of family pity, but as the one holding authority the Rossi family had never expected him to wield. Jonah's eyes flicked to the cake under the glass dome. The ceremonial dessert remained untouched, a silent observer of the unfolding reckoning. And with every eye on him, Jonah felt the afternoon bend around a single undeniable truth. The Rossi family hierarchy had shifted, and there was no turning back. The first wave of panic was building, and the next moves would define the remainder of the day. 13. The first wave of panic rippled through the Rossi household like a sudden gust across still waters. Marco's usual composure, carefully honed over decades, fractured ever so slightly. His eyes darted from the documents to Jonah, then to Luca, seeking some anchor, some familiar ground, but found none. Everything he had relied on to maintain authority, every assumption he had made about obedience and secrecy, had been undone in a single calm revelation. Luca's shoulders tensed visibly, his hand gripping the back of his chair as if it could steady the world that had suddenly shifted beneath him. He opened his mouth to speak, to protest, but the words failed to carry the weight they once had. For the first time, he could not rely on the rehearsed superiority that had kept Jonah in the shadows. Eleanor's hands trembled as she clutched the edge of the sideboard. She had always been the conductor of the Rossi narrative, orchestrating appearances so that the family's public image remained polished and harmonious. But the law, as recorded in black and white documents, was immune to charm, persuasion, or elegance. Her carefully cultivated authority could not override this reality. Guests around the garden leaned forward, some instinctively, some with awe, all now fully aware that they were witnessing the collapse of a household myth in real time. The neighbor from Clifton shifted uneasily in his chair. Even minor attendees who had come expecting polite tradition understood the stakes. The quiet dropout son had quietly amassed a force no one could ignore. Priya finally found her voice. Her tone was measured but sharp. "Luca, what does this mean for the properties?" Jonah's eyes met hers. Calm, neutral, unshakable. "It means," he said simply, "that no refinancing, no transfer, no alteration of ownership can occur without my acknowledgement. And because my authorization is already legally recorded, any further action without adherence to that record is invalid." A low murmur spread among the guests. The gravity of the legal reality sank in. For years, Jonah had been dismissed as incompetent, a dropout, a subordinate presence in the family narrative. Today, he stood as the legal fulcrum, a pivot around which the Rossi household now rotated. Marco's voice, restrained but tight, cut through the murmurs. "Jonah, surely there must be a way to resolve this, without public embarrassment." Jonah's expression did not change. "The resolution," he said, "has already occurred. It required no theatrics, no negotiation, no public approval. The law and timing have aligned. The outcome is beyond dispute." Luca's laugh came out forced, sharp, brittle. "This isn't happening," he yelled, gesturing wildly toward the documents. "You're overstepping." Jonah lowered the papers slowly, letting the calm in his posture speak louder than any argument. "I'm not overstepping," he said. "I'm simply pointing out what has already been done." The garden seemed to hold its breath. The cake under the glass dome gleamed innocently, a silent witness to the quiet dismantling of the Rossi hierarchy. And as the guests adjusted uneasily in their seats, Jonah realized the first truly irreversible moment had arrived. The family could no longer pretend the dropout was powerless. Everything they assumed about obedience, control, and hierarchy had just been rewritten. And the next move, whether by Marco, Luke, or Eleanor, would reveal the depth of the consequences. 14. Luca's face twisted between disbelief and fury. His usual rehearsed composure had completely evaporated. He stepped toward the table, hand brushing against the documents in an attempt to reclaim dominance, though everyone could see the futility of the gesture. "You can't do this," he said sharply, voice rising now. "You have no right to block the refinancing." Jonah's eyes remained steady, unflinching. "The right," he said calmly, "is recorded on paper. Authorization has already been submitted and legally confirmed. Any attempt to override it would be invalid and could create liability for anyone attempting it." Marco's hands gripped the back of a chair. "Jonah," he said carefully, "surely there is some misunderstanding here. Surely we can resolve this quietly. There's no need for public confrontation." "I see no misunderstanding," Jonah replied. "The documents are legitimate. The signatures are valid. The timing is deliberate. And because it has been submitted correctly, there is no room for negotiation." The guests shifted uneasily, sensing the scale of what was unfolding. The Father's Day lunch they had anticipated, a polite ceremony of gratitude and familial civility, had become a stage for a legal reckoning. Each person understood that they were now witnessing a quietly orchestrated reversal of the Rossi family hierarchy. Priya's voice finally cut through the tension, calm but firm. "Luca, what does this mean for the properties?" Jonah met her gaze evenly. "It means that no refinancing, no transfers, no alteration of ownership can occur without my explicit acknowledgement. And because the authorization is already legally recorded, any further action without compliance is invalid." A low murmur spread across the garden. For decades, Jonah had been labeled the dropout, dismissed as incapable, relegated to the periphery. Now, with legal authority in hand, he was the one holding the balance of power. Eleanor's hand trembled as she clutched the sideboard. Marco's expression hardened, jaw tight, as he processed the reality that control had shifted irrevocably. Luca's usual confidence faltered completely. Teresa, seated calmly, adjusted her glasses and examined the documents again. "Indeed," she said softly, "any attempt to circumvent this would carry legal consequences." Jonah glanced at the cake beneath its glass dome. It remained untouched, a silent witness to the upheaval. For years, it had represented the family's rituals, their performances of civility. Now, it stood as a symbol of what had been hidden and what could no longer be ignored. The first wave of panic had begun. Guests sensed it, the family felt it, and Jonah knew that the next moves would define the rest of the afternoon. And as he folded his hands over the documents, calm and deliberate, he realized something he had long known. Authority wielded quietly, with preparation and timing, could be far more powerful than any shout, any threat, or any plea. The Rossi household had been shaken, but this was only the beginning. The true reckoning, the moment when consequences met pride, was still approaching. And the cake waited, silently reflecting sunlight, as if counting the seconds until the next revelation. 15, the first tremor of panic had spread through the Rossi family, but now it escalated into a near-visible ripple. Marco's face darkened, lines deepening around his eyes as he recognized that authority he had long assumed was no longer his to wield. Luca's usual posture of confident superiority had crumpled, replaced by tension so sharp it made the guests flinch. Eleanor's hand hovered over the sideboard, trembling slightly, betraying the first true crack in the family's polished facade. Jonah remained still, calm, letting the weight of his presence do the work his words could not. The documents on the patio table lay open and undeniable, the solicitor's stamp bright under the afternoon sun. Each guest could see the proof: signatures, dates, and authorization lines that legitimized Jonah's claim. Each witness became part of the unfolding accountability, unable to ignore what had just occurred. Priya's voice, measured but urgent, cut through the tense air. "Luca, what does this mean?" she asked. "It means," Jonah replied quietly, "that no refinancing, no property transfer, no manipulation of the family's assets can occur without my consent. And because the authorization has already been legally recorded, any attempt to bypass it is invalid." Luca's laugh emerged, strained and brittle. "You think you can hold us all hostage with papers?" he spat, gesturing toward the documents. "I'm not holding anyone hostage," Jonah said evenly. "I'm simply enforcing what has already been recorded. The law does not bend for comfort, nor does it accommodate assumption." Marco stepped closer, voice lower now, attempting to reclaim control. "Jonah," he said, "there must be a way to resolve this quietly. Surely there is negotiation possible." Jonah shook his head. "No negotiation is needed. The legal record speaks for itself." The retired banker leaned forward, whispering to a guest. "Any attempt to act without Jonah's authorization," he said, "would constitute a legal breach. This is not speculation. It is a documented fact." Eleanor's hand clutched the sideboard tighter. Her eyes flicked to Jonah, then to the documents, then to the guests. The weight of public witnesses made it impossible to dismiss or spin the revelation as easily as she had done in the past. The cake, pale cream under its glass dome, gleamed innocently in the sun. For years, it had been a centerpiece of tradition and performance, a silent stage prop in Rossi family rituals. Now it watched, silent and still, as the first truly irreversible shift in power took place. Jonah's gaze moved over the family. The first wave of panic had begun, the second deeper shock, the one that would unravel old assumptions and force accountability, was only moments away. Because once legal authority met public witness, the Rossi family hierarchy could no longer function as it had for decades. And as Jonah straightened, placing a careful hand on the table beside the envelope, he knew the moment of true confrontation, the climax of the day's quiet reckoning, was about to arrive. 16. The tension in the garden now felt almost physical, like the air had thickened around the Rossi family, compressing every polite gesture and strained smile into tight, brittle forms. Marco's jaw worked as he tried to process the implications of Jonah's calm assertion. Authority, control, and decades of unchallenged family dominance now teetered on the edge of collapse. Luca's usual confidence had dissolved entirely. His hands fidgeted at the edge of the patio table, one gripping the back of a chair while the other hovered over the documents, as though mere contact could reclaim the power that had just slipped away. Every rehearsed argument, every polished retort, fell flat in the face of reality, meticulously documented and publicly displayed. Eleanor's fingers trembled along the edge of the sideboard. She had spent years controlling perception, orchestrating appearances, and carefully placing blame to preserve the family narrative. Today, the facade had shattered, leaving her with only instinct and panic to navigate the unraveling truth. Guests shifted uneasily in their chairs. Murmurs passed through them, soft but insistent. This was no longer a private family drama. It was a public demonstration of legal authority overriding assumed hierarchy. Everyone realized that the dropout son, the one dismissed for years, had quietly become the pivot around which the Rossi household now turned. Priya's voice rose, calm but insistent. "Luca, what does this mean for the properties?" Jonah's gaze met hers, steady and composed. "It means that no refinancing, no transfer, no alteration of ownership can occur without my acknowledgement. The legal record has already been filed. Any further action without adherence to it is invalid." Marco's hands swept the air dismissively, trying to regain some sense of control. "Jonah," he said carefully, "there must be some misunderstanding. Surely we can resolve this without causing a scene." Jonah shook his head slightly, expression calm. "There is no misunderstanding. The solicitor's documents are accurate. The authorization has been properly submitted. The law requires nothing more than acknowledgement, which has already been recorded." Luca's frustration finally broke into an edge of panic. "This isn't happening," he shouted. "You can't. This is impossible." Jonah lowered the papers slowly, letting the calm in his demeanor underscore the gravity of the situation. "I'm not disputing anything," he said. "I'm simply pointing out that the reality is already established, legally and publicly." Aunt Teresa, seated at the far end of the table, adjusted her glasses and studied the documents carefully. "Any attempt to override this," she said, "would create legal consequences. The signatures are authentic. The timing is indisputable." The retired banker leaned closer to a neighbor, disarrayed, whispering quietly, "If the documents are valid, any attempt to bypass Jonah's authority is risky, legally and financially." The garden seemed to shrink under the weight of realization. For decades, Jonah had been dismissed, marginalized, and labeled a failure. Today, he had flipped that narrative entirely, demonstrating that preparation, timing, and legal authority outweighed the years of manipulation and assumption. And the cake, still untouched beneath its glass dome, gleamed innocently in the sunlight, bearing silent witness to the Rossi family's first real confrontation with undeniable truth. The first major shock had landed. The second, more devastating wave, the full collapse of control and the confrontation of decades-long assumptions, was now inevitable. And Jonah, calm and composed, waited for it to begin. 17, the garden fell into a heavy silence, broken only by the soft shuffle of chairs and the distant hum of traffic from Bristol's streets. Every eye was on Jonah now, not with curiosity, but with a dawning comprehension. The quiet dropout they had spent years dismissing was no longer powerless. The documents on the patio table were more than paper. They were authority, proof, and a lever capable of toppling decades of family hierarchy. Marco ran a hand down his face, exhaling sharply through his nose. "Jonah," he said, measured but tense, "there must be some mistake. Surely the solicitor can clarify. Surely there's room to fix this quietly." Jonah's gaze did not waver. "There is no mistake," he said calmly. "Every signature, every authorization, every date has been verified. The law and the solicitor's confirmation stand. The refinancing cannot proceed without my recorded consent because it has already been given and legally accepted." Luca's fingers tapped the patio table rapidly. "You're bluffing," he shouted, voice cracking with frustration. "Banks don't allow this. I am not bluffing," Jonah said evenly. "The bank has confirmed it. The documents are legal and binding." Guests shifted uncomfortably, sensing the seismic shift in the Rossi family's dynamics. The polite Father's Day gathering they had anticipated, laughter, small talk, traditional smiles, was now a quiet battlefield. Jonah had seized control not with rage or drama, but with timing, documentation, and precision. Priya stepped forward, her voice measured but anxious. "Luca, what does this mean for the house?" Jonah looked directly at her. "No refinancing, no transfers, no adjustments can occur without my consent. The authorization exists, it is valid, and the legal record ensures that nothing can be done without recognition of that fact." Marco's hand hovered over the table, as if he could physically reclaim authority by touch. "Jonah," he said carefully, "perhaps we can find a way to handle this privately, without involving all these witnesses." Jonah shook his head slightly. "There is no need for privacy. The witnesses are exactly why the documents arrived today. Public acknowledgement is the only way to ensure that years of dismissal and assumed control are corrected once and for all." Teresa adjusted her glasses, scanning the documents with meticulous attention. "Luca," she said quietly, "have you knowingly filed refinancing documents using Jonah's name without consent?" Luca's face flushed red. "Don't be ridiculous," he muttered, though the tremor in his voice betrayed panic. Teresa placed the papers flat on the table. "The signature is here." Marco's jaw tightened. This cannot be." Jonah's calm voice cut through the tension. "It is exactly what it says. Authorization exists. Legal control has shifted. Any action contrary to it is invalid." The guests whispered among themselves, some leaning forward, some exchanging astonished glances. For years, Jonah had been dismissed, labeled a failure, and sidelined in the family narrative. Today, he stood at the center of authority, quietly orchestrating the unraveling of assumptions. And the cake under the glass dome, untouched and gleaming, watched silently as the Rossi household faced its first true reckoning of the afternoon. The first major wave of panic had landed. Now the second, more devastating, more irreversible, was building. And Jonah, calm and steady, waited for the family to realize just how completely their assumptions had been dismantled. 18, the second wave of tension hit almost imperceptibly at first. Luca's breathing became uneven, each exhale sharper than the last, a physical manifestation of panic he could not contain. Marco's eyes darted between Jonah and the documents, searching desperately for a flaw, a loophole, anything that could restore control. Eleanor's lips pressed into a thin line, hands still hovering over the sideboard, her calm composure cracking for the first time in public. Jonah stood beside the patio table, silent, letting the documents speak. Every signature, every stamp, every legal line acted as a tether to reality, one the Rossi family could not ignore. He did not raise his voice, he did not threaten. He simply waited, calm and deliberate, while the storm of consequences began to form around them. Priya's voice broke the silence, low but cutting through the tension. "Luca, this means you can't proceed with anything without his acknowledgement, right?" Jonah nodded once. "Correct. Any refinancing, transfer, or financial maneuver involving the properties is invalid without my recorded consent. And since my consent has already been submitted, any further attempt without legal procedure is ineffective." The retired banker leaned forward, whispering to the neighbor beside him. "If the documents are legitimate," he said, "anyone trying to override Jonah's authority would face serious legal exposure." Marco's hand clenched into a fist at his side. "Jonah," he said carefully, "surely there's a way to resolve this without complete upheaval." "No," Jonah replied evenly. "The resolution is already established. The law is clear. Any action contrary to the documentation is invalid." Luca laughed, but it was hollow, brittle, and sharp. "This isn't happening," he shouted. "You can't just—" Jonah interrupted, calm, voice precise. "I'm not disputing anything. I'm pointing out what has already been done and properly recorded." Eleanor's hand trembled as she rested it on the sideboard. Her carefully cultivated image of control was crumbling, and the presence of witnesses made denial impossible. She glanced toward the guests, some of whom had shifted uncomfortably in their seats, realizing they were seeing authority redefined in real time. Teresa, ever composed, adjusted her glasses and leaned over the documents again. She looked up, her voice steady. "Luca," she said, "knowingly filing refinancing documents under Jonah's name without consent is legally questionable at best. The signatures are authentic, and the timing is undisputed." The garden seemed to contract further under the weight of realization. For years, Jonah had been the dropout, the invisible son, the one relegated to the periphery of family power. Today, he had become the one holding the ultimate leverage. The cake, untouched beneath its glass dome, reflected the afternoon sun like a silent witness, a centerpiece of tradition now overshadowed by documentation and quiet authority. Marco's jaw tightened further, Luca's face turned red, and Eleanor's calm mask had completely faltered. The Rossi household had entered a new phase, the first full confrontation between their assumptions and reality. Jonah stood poised, waiting, because the crescendo of consequences, the moment when decades of manipulation and control would collide with undeniable authority, was about to strike. And no one at the table, not even the favored sibling, could stop it. 19. The garden's air had shifted into something almost tangible, heavy, with the knowledge that the Rossi family's long-standing order had been overturned. Guests shifted nervously, some whispering, others holding their expressions in careful neutrality, but all were aware they were witnessing something extraordinary, the quiet dethroning of assumptions that had dominated decades. Luca's hands trembled slightly on the edge of the patio table. He had spent years positioning himself at the center of the family's narrative, always confident that his brother would remain the dropout, a foil to his own polished competence. Now every carefully cultivated advantage was slipping. Every word he had ever spoken to undermine Jonah came back to confront him in this public moment. Marco's jaw worked silently as he tried to measure the situation. He had long relied on silence, intimidation, and authority to control outcomes. Today, the legal documents had neutralized every tactic he knew. The house, the properties, the refinancing, each asset once entirely under his assumed control now required Jonah's acknowledgement. Eleanor finally spoke, her voice tight. "Jonah," she said, almost pleading, "surely you can understand our concern. Surely we can find a way to—" "I understand perfectly," Jonah said evenly, cutting through the tension. "But concern cannot override legality. The authorization has been submitted, confirmed, and recorded. Any further action without it is invalid." Aunt Teresa's eyes flicked over the papers again, unwavering. "Luca," she said quietly, "any attempt to proceed contrary to this record would be legally and financially risky. The signatures are authentic. Timing is indisputable." Luca's shoulders slumped slightly, the bravado he relied upon all these years evaporating in an instant. Priya stepped closer to Jonah, trying to understand the scope of what had just been revealed. "This," she said softly, "you're effectively in control?" Jonah nodded once. "Correct. Not by choice, but by law. Any action contrary to this authorization is invalid." The guests' whispers increased as realization sank in. A simple Father's Day lunch had transformed into an irrevocable demonstration of power and accountability. For decades, Jonah had been dismissed, labeled incompetent and marginalized. Today, he held the legal and procedural authority to redefine his family's hierarchy. The cake beneath its glass dome reflected sunlight, untouched and unassuming, as if it were a witness to a quiet but irreversible revolution. Marco's face darkened further. He moved toward the documents, hand outstretched, but paused as the weight of the legal reality pressed down. Luca's protests had turned into muttered frustration. Eleanor's composure had fractured completely. Jonah remained calm, his presence measured and unflinching. The first wave of panic had passed, but the second, the full reckoning of decades of assumption, hierarchy, and manipulation, was crashing down. And every eye in the garden understood. Nothing about the Rossi household would ever be the same. The next moments would reveal the true depth of consequences, and Jonah knew the timing had never been more perfect. 20. The afternoon sunlight flickered across the garden as if uncertain whether to illuminate or retreat, casting the Rossi family into a suspended moment of tension. Every guest, every neighbor, every witness who had come expecting a polite Father's Day ceremony now felt the weight of a reckoning they could not ignore. Jonah stood beside the patio table, calm, the documents in his hand, radiating authority not through anger or theatrics, but through the undeniable force of legality and preparation. Marco's face had tightened into something unfamiliar, concern edged with fear. He had always relied on hierarchy, influence, and control to steer the family narrative. Today, the combination of law and witness left him exposed. He leaned slightly forward, trying to mask the tremor in his voice. "Jonah," he said carefully, "we can find a way to resolve this. Discreetly. There's no need to escalate in front of everyone." Jonah shook his head, deliberately slow. "There is no escalation. The documents already speak for themselves. The refinancing cannot proceed without my acknowledgement because it has already been legally submitted and recorded." Luca's voice, sharp now and rising, cut through the soft murmur of the garden. "This is ridiculous," he shouted, pacing near the patio table. "You can't. This isn't how things work. You're overstepping." "I'm not overstepping," Jonah said evenly. "I'm enforcing what has already been recorded. Every legal step, every signature, every date is verified. Any attempt to act outside of it is invalid." Eleanor's hand gripped the edge of the sideboard, knuckles white. Her carefully maintained image of control had crumbled, and she glanced toward the guests for support, only to realize that the presence of witnesses made excuses impossible. Every lie, every manipulation, every assumption about Jonah's incapacity was exposed to scrutiny. Priya stepped closer, her voice careful but firm. "Luca," she said, whispering so only he could hear. "What are we going to do?" Luca's jaw worked, but no words came. For the first time, he faced the reality that his position, his assumed authority, was no longer unchallenged. Teresa, calm as ever, adjusted her glasses and leaned forward. Any attempt to bypass Jonah's authority, she said, would carry legal consequences. The signatures are authentic. The timing is undisputed. A soft murmur ran through the guests. Some leaned forward in fascination, others shifted uneasily. The afternoon had become a demonstration of quiet but absolute authority. Jonah had been dismissed for years, labeled a failure, a dropout, irrelevant in family matters. Today, he had flipped that narrative entirely, using preparation, timing, and the law as instruments of power. The cake, still untouched beneath the glass dome, reflected sunlight like a silent observer. The ceremonial dessert had become irrelevant, a mere prop in the theater of accountability. Jonah's gaze swept over the family, calm, measured, deliberate. The first major wave of panic had struck. The second, devastating wave, the complete collapse of old assumptions and the confrontation with years of neglected respect, was now cresting, and the Rossi family could feel it coming. Every member of the household, every guest, knew that the afternoon's first climax, the first undeniable disruption, had passed, but the final reckoning, the moment that would leave consequences impossible to ignore, was inevitable. 21. The garden felt smaller now, almost suffocating, as if the carefully trimmed hedges had contracted around the Rossi family. The guests shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, realizing they were no longer observers of a polite Father's Day lunch, but witnesses to a quiet, irreversible upheaval. Every word, every glance, every document on the patio table carried weight beyond its immediate meaning. Marco's face darkened further, the usual calm authority replaced by a flicker of uncertainty he could not hide. "Jonah," he said carefully, "surely we can resolve this without further complication. There must be a way to address the refinancing quietly." Jonah's voice remained calm, deliberate, unyielding. "There is nothing to resolve. The law, the documentation, and the timing have already ensured the outcome. The refinancing cannot proceed without my consent because it has already been legally recorded." Luca's hands gripped the back of a chair as his voice rose in frustration. "This is absurd," he shouted, pacing slightly. "You can't just... This isn't proper. You're overstepping." "I am not overstepping," Jonah said evenly. "I'm simply enforcing what is already documented. Every signature, every date, every procedural step is valid and binding. Any action contrary to it is ineffective and legally invalid." Eleanor's hand trembled as she rested it against the sideboard. Her carefully maintained facade of control had completely cracked, and the presence of witnesses made any attempt to spin or dismiss the situation impossible. Priya stepped closer to Jonah, her voice quiet but sharp. "Luca," she asked, "you mean no one can bypass this?" Jonah nodded once. "Correct. My authorization is recorded. Any further action without adherence to the legal record is invalid." Teresa, seated across the table, adjusted her glasses and studied the documents again. "Any attempt to act contrary to this," she said, "would carry serious legal consequences. The signatures are authentic. Timing is indisputable." The guests whispered softly among themselves, understanding the unprecedented gravity of the moment. For decades, Jonah had been the marginalized son, the dropout, ignored in matters of consequence. Today, he stood at the center of authority, wielding quiet power that required no shouting or theatrics. The cake, gleaming beneath its glass dome, remained untouched, a silent witness to the unraveling of control. Marco's hands clenched, Luca's shoulders slumped, and Eleanor's composure faltered completely. The Rossi household was now fully exposed to the reality of Jonah's quiet, methodical ascent to authority. And Jonah, calm and measured, waited. Because the final devastating wave, the moment when decades of hierarchy, assumption, and manipulation would be confronted fully, was arriving. And there would be no retreat. The Rossi family was about to learn the cost of underestimating the son they had long dismissed. 22. The afternoon sunlight began to dip, stretching long shadows across the garden, but the Rossi household remained trapped in the tension of revelation. Jonah stood beside the patio table, documents resting in front of him like silent arbiters of truth, his calm composure a stark contrast to the fraying nerves around him. The first waves of panic had passed, but now the deeper consequences were taking hold, subtle, inexorable, and impossible to ignore. Marco's fingers drummed on the edge of the table, a barely restrained agitation threatening to erupt. "Jonah," he said, each word measured. "Surely we can find a solution without public embarrassment. Surely there's a compromise to be made." Jonah shook his head slowly. "There is no compromise," he said, voice even and deliberate. "The legal record is clear. The refinancing cannot proceed without my consent, which has already been submitted and confirmed." Luca's hands curled into fists, nails digging into the wood. "You're ridiculous," he spat. "This is impossible. I manage these matters. How can you?" "I do not manage them," Jonah said simply. "The law does. And the documents submitted today reflect reality, not assumptions." Eleanor's lips pressed tightly together. She had always been the orchestrator, the one who maintained the Rossi facade, controlling appearances and expectations. But the combination of legal authority, timing, and witnesses had stripped her of the ability to spin or delay. Her carefully constructed narrative had collapsed in the sunlit garden. Priya's eyes darted between Jonah and Luca. "So," she whispered, "the refinancing, the ownership, he controls it?" Jonah nodded once. "Legally, yes. The authority exists. Any attempt to override it without following proper procedure is invalid." Teresa, adjusting her glasses, leaned closer, voice calm but commanding. "Luca," she said, "knowingly using your brother's name without consent could create serious legal consequences. The signatures are authentic, the timing indisputable." Guests exchanged startled glances. They had arrived expecting a polite family ceremony. Instead, they had witnessed decades of hierarchy quietly dismantled by preparation, timing, and documentation. Jonah, long dismissed and marginalized, had seized control, not with emotion or drama, but through the unassailable weight of law and procedure. The cake under the glass dome glinted in the late afternoon sun. Its innocent perfection belied the chaos surrounding it. It had been a centerpiece of family ritual, but now it was merely a silent observer of the Rossi family's reckoning. Marco's jaw tightened. Luca's confidence was gone, replaced with panic and disbelief. Eleanor's composure had fractured completely. Jonah stood, calm, letting the gravity of the moment settle over everyone present. The first wave of panic had passed. The second, more devastating wave, the confrontation with decades of manipulation, dismissal, and assumed control, was cresting, and the Rossi family knew, silently and undeniably, that nothing about the afternoon or their hierarchy would ever be the same. The final reckoning was here, and Jonah was ready. 23. The garden seemed suspended in that moment, every guest frozen as if the air itself had thickened around them. Jonah stood calmly beside the patio table, the solicitor's documents laid open before everyone, unassailable and precise. The first wave of panic had tested the Rossi family, but now the second, deeper wave, the one that would dismantle decades of hierarchy and assumptions, was washing over them, slow, inevitable, unstoppable. Luca's hands trembled as he leaned over the table. He had spent years cultivating control, relying on Jonah's perceived incapacity to maintain a comfortable hierarchy. But now that assumption lay in ruins. He tried to assert himself, voice pitched and sharp. "This isn't possible," he shouted. "You can't just..." Jonah's calm gaze met his brother's. "I'm not doing anything new," he said evenly. "I'm simply pointing out what has already been done. Every signature, every date, every authorization has been verified and is legally binding. The refinancing cannot proceed without my acknowledgement because it has already been submitted." Marco's jaw tightened. "Jonah," he said, each word deliberate, "surely we can handle this quietly, find a resolution without public embarrassment?" "There is nothing to negotiate," Jonah replied. "The legal record speaks for itself. Any attempt to bypass it is invalid." Eleanor's hand shook slightly as she rested it on the sideboard. For years, she had maintained appearances, managed expectations, and controlled the family narrative. Today, all of that carefully orchestrated authority had been stripped away. The law and the witnesses were impartial. There could be no spin, no subtle reframing, no hiding. Priya stepped closer, voice low but urgent. "Luca," she said, "the properties, the refinancing, he's in control?" Jonah nodded. "Legally, yes. The documents confirm it. Any action taken contrary to the authorization is invalid." Teresa, still seated, adjusted her glasses and leaned in. "Any attempt to override Jonah's authority," she said calmly, "would carry serious legal consequences. The signatures are authentic, the timing indisputable." A hush fell over the garden. Guests realized the gravity of the moment. A simple Father's Day lunch had become a demonstration of quiet but absolute authority. Jonah, long dismissed as a failure, a dropout, now wielded control the Rossi family could not ignore. The cake, untouched under the glass dome, reflected the fading sunlight like a silent witness. Its ceremonial perfection had become irrelevant in the face of legal truth. Marco's expression darkened further. Luca's confidence was gone. Eleanor's composure shattered. The Rossi household had reached a tipping point. Jonah's calm, deliberate presence underscored the inevitable. Decades of assumptions, dismissals, and manipulation were now meeting reality head-on. The stage was set. The final act, the full reckoning, was imminent. And Jonah, poised and resolute, held the authority that could no longer be ignored. 24, the afternoon lights softened, casting long shadows across the garden, but the tension remained electric, thick enough to press against everyone present. Jonah stood beside the patio table, calm, composed, letting the documents speak for him. Every signature, every date, every legal notation was a hammer, striking down decades of assumed authority. The Rossi family's hierarchy had crumbled in quiet precision, leaving only the truth and its consequences. Marco's hands rested on the table, fingers pressing lightly into the wood, but his composure had completely fractured. He realized now that his influence, his carefully cultivated control, could not counteract the law or the meticulous timing Jonah had orchestrated. His face, once so confident, now bore the tension of someone who had misjudged the magnitude of his own son. Luca, usually brimming with assured superiority, was nearly unrecognizable. His shoulders sagged, his jaw tight, and his hands fidgeted nervously. The dropout they had ridiculed for years now held the leverage they had assumed belonged to him. Every insult, every public taunt, every whispered humiliation now rebounded on the family itself, witnessed by all. Eleanor's hands trembled as she gripped the sideboard. Her meticulously maintained composure, the armor of civility she had worn for decades, had shattered. The law and the witnesses left no room for spin, for manipulation, for delay. The polished illusion of family authority had given way to reality. Priya's eyes were wide, finally seeing the full scope of what had been hidden. She had glimpsed pieces of Jonah's accomplishments, but the scale of his authority, quietly achieved and perfectly timed, was undeniable. Luca's power, long assumed absolute, had evaporated in the presence of proof. Aunt Teresa adjusted her glasses, surveying the scene with calm precision. Any attempt to bypass Jonah's authority, she said, would be both legally and financially reckless. The signatures are authentic, the timing indisputable. The guests, silent until now, shifted in their chairs, realizing they had witnessed something extraordinary. A Father's Day gathering transformed into a public reckoning. Jonah, long dismissed, marginalized, and labeled the dropout, had used restraint, preparation, and timing to assert control the family could not challenge. The cake beneath the glass dome glinted in the late sunlight, an innocent centerpiece of a ceremony now made irrelevant by legal truth. It had watched silently as decades of hierarchy, assumptions, and control were undone. Marco's jaw tightened, Luca's posture collapsed, and Eleanor's composure shattered completely. The Rossi household had reached the point of no return. Jonah, calm, measured, and unshakable, let the moment settle over the garden. Decades of neglect, dismissal, And manipulation had met accountability, and the family could do nothing to reverse it. The first major crisis had passed. The second, deeper reckoning. The confrontation with long-held assumptions, hidden manipulations, and the undeniable reality of Jonah's authority was complete. And as the last rays of sunlight glinted off the glass dome, the Rossi family realized the truth they had long ignored. Jonah had not only reclaimed respect, he had done it with restraint, dignity, and unassailable authority. No apologies could erase the lesson. No manipulation could undo the law. And in that quiet yet absolute moment, Jonah had won. Not through theatrics, not through revenge, but through timing, preparation, and undeniable evidence. The Rossi household would never look at him or themselves the same way again.